The night of the Whitcomb Winter Ball began with the hush of anticipation that only the great houses of London could command. Gaslight shimmered across 100 mirrors. Violins trembled in the air like restrained laughter, and every lady moved as though watched by history itself. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb descended the marble staircase with the serene grace expected of the Earl's only daughter. Pale silk gliding, diamonds trembling at her throat, her eyes bright but careful. Society adored her composure, her quiet wit, her rumored kindness toward those beneath her station. Yet beneath that poised calm, Eleanor's heart fluttered with something fragile, a hope that perhaps tonight her father's gaze would soften, that perhaps she might earn not just his pride, but his affection. But among the glittering assembly stood a man whose presence felt like the shadow of a storm. Lord Charles Ashcombe, known to friends and foes alike as Ducky, had returned from exile on the continent after years of silence. Once the charming son of a noble house, he now bore the faint air of ruin, the dark tailoring too austere, the smile that never reached his eyes. Those who whispered behind their fans spoke of debts, of disgrace, of a family stripped of lands and legacy. None said aloud what all knew, that it was the Earl of Whitcomb's ruthless ambition that had crushed the Ashcombes and driven Ducky's father to an early grave. Eleanor had never met him, yet when their eyes met across the ballroom, something in his gaze struck her, not admiration but appraisal. It was as though he sought a weakness to exploit. She turned away too quickly, offering her hand to a partner whose name she immediately forgot. But through every waltz, she felt his stare, steady and unrelenting, like the pressure of a confession waiting to happen. When the music ended, the scent of roses and champagne hung heavy in the air. Ducky approached at last, bowing with impeccable form. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate, "might I have the honor of one dance, for the sake of old ties?" The mention of ties, what ties, unsettled her, yet the murmur of onlookers left her no polite way to refuse. She accepted, and as his gloved hand touched hers, a chill traced her skin. Their waltz was flawless, precise, and hollow of joy. Beneath the chandeliers, he moved with a soldier's restraint, his gaze fixed not upon her beauty, but upon her lineage, her fortune, her father's name. Eleanor sensed it. This was no flirtation. There was something dangerous beneath his civility, something calculated. When the final chord faded, he led her not toward the refreshment table, but down a side corridor lined with marble busts and whispering ivy. In the conservatory, moonlight spilled through glass, painting the orchids silver. "My lord," Eleanor began, her composure thinning, "I must return." He interrupted softly. "Your father ruined mine, Lady Eleanor. Did you know that?" Her breath caught. "I know my father bought the Ashcombe debts, turned my family's estate into his latest triumph." His smile was thin, almost tender. "And yet, how curious that fate brings me here, to his daughter, the jewel of the season." Eleanor stepped back, her heart thudding. "If this is a jest, it is cruel." "Cruel?" His voice lowered. "No, only fitting. Every dynasty must pay its due." He moved closer, the air between them trembling with unsaid things. The soft brush of her sleeve against his arm was enough, the faintest sound of silk and breath, and at that precise, ruinous moment, the glass doors opened. A gasp rippled through the doorway. Lady Darnley stood frozen, eyes wide with delight and scandal. Behind her, others followed, faces hungry for mischief. Ducky did not move. Eleanor turned, words of innocence dying on her tongue. The tableau was perfect, the disgraced gentleman and the Earl's daughter, alone beneath the moonlit vines. By morning, the story had traveled faster than any carriage. Compromised society murmured, in the conservatory no less. Invitations were rescinded before breakfast. The Earl of Whitcomb's fury could be heard across Grosvenor Square. And though Eleanor wept, protesting her innocence, her father's decision was swift and merciless. The family honor must be preserved. There would be no delay, no scandal trial, only a wedding. Thus, Within 3 days, the bells tolled not for celebration but atonement. Eleanor stood before the altar of St. Bartholomew's, her veil trembling in the draught, her groom expressionless beside her. Ducky's vow was steady, his voice devoid of warmth. He had achieved what he came for, her name, her ruin, his vengeance sealed in holy promise. Outside, rain swept across the cobblestones, relentless as judgment. As they emerged from the chapel, the crowd's curiosity was thinly veiled behind polite applause. The carriage awaited, its black horses restless beneath the downpour. Eleanor's hands were cold within her gloves. She dared not look at the man who now bore her name. Inside the carriage, silence reigned. The rhythmic patter of rain filled the space between them. Ducky stared out the window, jaw clenched, every muscle composed into stillness. Eleanor, her tears long since spent, turned her face away and whispered only once, not to him, but to herself, "God help me." He heard her. His expression did not change. Yet for the briefest instant, as the carriage wheels rolled toward Ashcombe Manor and the smoke of London faded behind them, a shadow crossed his eyes, not of triumph, but of something quieter, harder to name. Regret, perhaps, or of the first faint tremor of conscience. The narrator's voice might well have murmured, had anyone been listening. Thus began a marriage not born of affection, but of vengeance, a union the world would watch, and history would never quite forgive. Ashcombe Manor stood upon the northern moors like a remnant of an age that had forgotten joy. Its towers, blackened by rain and neglect, loomed above the fields where no laughter lingered. The carriage arrived at dusk, and Eleanor, pale from sleepless nights, descended into the wind. The door swung open with a hollow groan, and within the hall the air smelled faintly of damp stone and memories. Ducky stood beside her, coat dripping, offering no arm, no word of comfort. The servants bowed, uncertain whether to pity or fear their new mistress. "Her ladyship will take the east wing," he said curtly. "See that her things are arranged." His tone bore no cruelty, only detachment, the voice of a man who had sealed his heart against compassion. Eleanor inclined her head, acknowledging the order as though it were law. She followed the housekeeper through corridors lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to judge her arrival. The chamber was spacious but cold. No fire had been lit. She dismissed the maid, unwilling to show frailty, and sat upon the edge of the bed, listening to the wind gnawing at the shutters. Somewhere below, Ducky's footsteps echoed and faded, swallowed by the cavernous dark. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the house settled into silence. Ducky rose early, spending long hours in his study or riding across the moor. He spoke little at meals, offering neither cruelty nor kindness. His gaze, when it met hers, carried the polite emptiness of a man enduring a task already regretted. Yet Eleanor did not retreat into despair. There was steel beneath her quiet manners, a resolve he had not anticipated. She walked the estate, spoke gently to the servants, and began to notice the poverty in the surrounding village, the hollow eyes of children, the tired faces of miners' wives who curtsied with too much humility. On the third morning, she ventured into the village unaccompanied, leaving her carriage at the edge of the road. The air was thick with coal smoke and sea salt. A child ran barefoot past her, coughing. A mother hurried after him with a threadbare shawl. Eleanor pressed a coin into the woman's hand, but it was the small act of tucking the shawl around the child's shoulders that drew murmured thanks. That night, when she returned to the manor, Ducky was waiting in the foyer. "You went to the village," he said. "It was not a question." "I did. I prefer my wife not be seen wandering among laborers." "Invites talk." "Then let them talk," she replied softly. "I find their company more honest than that of the drawing rooms that condemn me." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. He turned away, yet as he did, a flicker of unease crossed his features. Her defiance was not loud, but it was steady, and it unsettled the script of revenge he had written. The winter deepened. Rumors drifted from London. Letters arrived bearing thinly veiled pity from those who had once called Eleanor friend. She answered none. Instead, she found solace in the library, its shelves thick with dust, and in the neglected greenhouse, where she coaxed life back into the roses long left to wither. At times, she would catch Ducky watching her from the doorway, not with affection, but with bewilderment, as though he could not fathom how a woman so wronged could move through his house with such quiet dignity. One evening, when a storm rattled the windows and the servants had gone to bed, he heard the faint sound of a waltz drifting through the corridors. He followed it to the old ballroom, a cavern of faded grandeur. There, by the light of a single candle, Eleanor moved alone, her gown whispering across the dust. She turned as though an invisible partner guided her steps. For a moment, she looked almost happy. Ducky remained unseen, watching from the shadows, a strange ache blooming within him. When she curtsied to the silence, he slipped away before she could notice. The next morning, a small parcel appeared on her dressing table, a ruby brooch set in gold, gleaming like a drop of fire. The note read only, "A token of the house that is now yours." She assumed it a gesture of civility, perhaps remorse. She pinned it to her gown and wore it at dinner. Ducky's eyes flickered briefly to the jewel. It had once belonged to his mother. He had meant it as a cruel reminder of what her father had stolen, but seeing it against Eleanor's throat filled him with a confusion he despised. Days turned into weeks, and the house began, imperceptibly, to change. The servants grew warmer toward her. Laughter returned to the kitchen. Even the air seemed less oppressive, as though the manor itself softened in response to her presence. Ducky noticed, but did not interfere. Still, the old bitterness gnawed at him, whispering that his forgiveness would be betrayal to his father's memory. He clung to resentment as a soldier clings to his last weapon. Then one night, he found her collapsed upon the stairs, her hands trembling, fever burning in her cheeks. She had been tending to a child stricken with influenza in the village, refusing to call for help. Ducky lifted her easily, carrying her through the corridors he had once denied her. Her head rested against his shoulder, light as breath. He felt her heartbeat against his chest, and, for the first time in years, fear seized him, not of scandal, but of loss. When she woke in her chamber, the fire was roaring. He sat beside her, the brooch lying upon the bedside table. "You are reckless," he said quietly. "I am alive," she murmured, eyes half-lidded. "That is more than I can say for those your indifference abandons." He wanted to argue, but the sight of her weakened form silenced him. Instead, he reached out, hesitated, and brushed a curl from her brow. The touch startled them both. She met his gaze, and in that moment the distance between vengeance and remorse seemed perilously thin. Outside, the storm broke against the windows, wind howling across the moors. Ducky rose abruptly, retreating into the hall before he could betray himself. Yet as he closed the door, her faint whisper followed him. Not accusation, but something softer. Gratitude, perhaps, or forgiveness. He could not tell. He only knew that for the first time since the night of the ball, the taste of revenge no longer satisfied him. The storm arrived without warning. By dusk the sky had turned to iron, and rain beat against Ashcombe Manor like a siege. Lightning flashed across the moors, revealing the skeletal trees and the glimmer of flooded fields. Inside, the air was heavy with unease. Servants hurried to secure shutters while Ducky stood before the parlor window, his reflection fractured by every flicker of light. He had ridden out that morning, seeking distraction in the tempest's threat, but his thoughts had circled back, again and again, to the image of Eleanor pale and feverish in his arms. No act of vengeance had ever tormented him so completely as the memory of her whisper, that fragile defiance uttered from the edge of weakness. Unable to bear the stillness, he took a lamp and crossed the corridors, the flame bending in the draught. The manor felt alive tonight, its ancient bones creaking, the shadows shifting with purpose. He passed the ballroom where the echo of her solitary waltz still haunted the air, and something compelled him onward. The chapel door stood ajar, a faint glimmer flickering within. He stepped inside. There, before the cold altar, Eleanor knelt, her hands clasped around a candle that guttered in the wind. She did not startle at his entrance. She seemed beyond fear. "For whom do you pray?" he asked quietly. She turned, her expression solemn. "For your father," she said. "For the peace he was denied." His breath caught. "You have no right to speak his name." "Perhaps not. But I learned what my father did to yours, and I cannot rest knowing such cruelty lives unatoned. You sought revenge upon me, Lord Ashcombe, yet I was already carrying his sins in silence." The wind howled through the chapel, snuffing her candle. For a moment they were left in darkness, save the dim glow of his lamp. Ducky felt the ground tilt beneath the weight of her words. He had built his hatred upon the certainty of her guilt, and now it faltered. "You pity me," he said bitterly. "That is worse than hatred." "I do not pity you," she replied. "I understand you. There is a difference." Her voice trembled, yet her gaze held steady. "I understand the hunger to wound what wounded you. But if vengeance is all that remains, what will you be when it is gone?" He took a step closer, the light trembling between them. "You think forgiveness so simple." "No," she said. "It is the hardest thing in the world. That is why it is worth trying." The storm raged outside, rattling the stained glass until shards of color danced across the walls. For an instant, the lightning illuminated her face, the delicate curve of her jaw, the steadiness of her eyes, and something within him broke. He reached for her almost without knowing why. She did not flinch. His hand found her cheek, warm and trembling, and before he could summon reason, his lips met hers. The kiss was not born of tenderness. It was the collision of every emotion they had denied: anger, longing, grief, and the desperate need to feel alive again. She drew in a sharp breath, but did not pull away. The thunder rolled, and for a heartbeat they were no longer enemies, nor husband and wife, but two exiled souls clinging to the same spark in the storm. When at last he stepped back, both were trembling. "Forgive me," he whispered. "For the kiss?" she asked, breath unsteady. "For everything." His voice cracked. "I married you to punish your father. I meant to humiliate you, to make you suffer as I had suffered. But you have undone me with kindness." She looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "Then perhaps we are both prisoners of the same sin." He turned away, gripping the edge of the pew until his knuckles whitened. "You should hate me." "I did," she admitted. "But hatred is exhausting, my lord, and it changes nothing. What you have done cannot be undone, yet neither can what you are becoming." Her words lingered like incense in the air. Outside, the thunder eased, the storm's fury giving way to the steady rhythm of rain. Ducky sank to the bench opposite her, the weight of years pressing upon his shoulders. He had never felt smaller, nor more alive. The silence between them was fragile, sacred. When dawn came, pale light filtered through the cracked windows. They walked back through the corridor side by side, saying nothing. The servants, sensing the change, glanced at them in wonder. At breakfast, for the first time, Ducky spoke her name aloud. "Eleanor," he said, testing the syllables like a form prayer. She met his gaze with the faintest smile, and though no one else noticed, the gesture felt momentous, the first warmth between them untainted by deceit. Yet peace was not to linger long. That afternoon, a messenger arrived, soaked to the bone, bearing a sealed letter. Ducky broke the wax and read in silence. The words drained the color from his face. Eleanor watched, her cup paused midair. "My father," she asked quietly. He hesitated, then nodded. "Your father's holdings have failed. He is ruined." She rose, steady despite the tremor in her voice. "Then he needs us." He stared at her, disbelief flickering in his eyes. "After what he did?" "Yes," she said simply. "Because I am his daughter, and you are my husband. If we do not go to him, who will?" For a long moment, he said nothing. The conflict that had ruled his life warred silently within him. Pride against conscience, bitterness against love's fragile dawn. Finally, he folded the letter and placed it aside. "Very well," he said at last. "We go to London." Eleanor inclined her head, gratitude glimmering through fatigue. Outside, The rain had ceased, and the clouds parted to reveal a faint wash of sunlight across the moor. Ducky turned toward the window, the reflection of the rising light catching the edge of his expression. He looked not like a man vindicated, but like one newly burdened, a soul who had glimpsed redemption and was uncertain whether he deserved it. The silence stretched between them, no longer hostile, but filled with possibility. Somewhere in the distance, the first birds began to call through the thinning mist. The storm had broken, yet the greater tempest, the one within their hearts, was only beginning to stir. London greeted them not with warmth, but with the cold stare of familiarity. The fog hung thick over the city, rolling through the gaslit streets like a living thing. As their carriage clattered down Pall Mall, Ducky felt the old bitterness coil in his chest. This was the city that had once worshipped his family and then watched it fall. Now it was Eleanor who bore the weight of its scrutiny. Faces turned as they passed. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The disgraced Lady Wickham and her vengeful husband returned from exile. But Eleanor held her head high. Her poise was not arrogance. It was endurance refined into grace. The closer they came to her father's house, the more Ducky feared what lay behind that composure. The Wickham estate, once the pride of Mayfair, stood diminished. The garden was overgrown, the great iron gates streaked with rust. Inside, silence reigned. The Earl's servants had fled or been dismissed. Creditors circled like vultures. Ducky followed Eleanor through the echoing hall, his footsteps softening as he saw the ruin he had once wished upon them. The Earl lay upon a chaise, older than his years, his face carved by remorse. When Eleanor knelt beside him, his eyes flickered open with something between shame and wonder. "My child," he murmured, his voice cracked. "You should not have come. I gave you to a man's vengeance." "I came because you are my father," she replied, "and because no one deserves to die despised." The old man turned his gaze to Ducky. "And you," he rasped, "you came to see your triumph completed?" Ducky hesitated, then bowed his head. "I came to see that no man dies without forgiveness, my lord. Not even the one who made me what I was." The Earl's eyes glistened. "Then you are a better man than I ever was." His hand found Eleanor's, trembling. "Take what is left. My name is dust, but perhaps yours can yet mean mercy." His breath shuddered once, and then was gone. Eleanor pressed her forehead to her father's hand, silent tears tracing her cheeks. Ducky stood motionless, the enormity of it settling like ash upon his heart. The vengeance that had once defined him now seemed pitiful beside the quiet dignity of her grief. When at last she rose, she did not look broken but strangely calm, a woman who had faced the worst the world could offer and still chosen compassion. The funeral passed without fanfare. Society, ever hungry for spectacle, attended in abundance, their curiosity wrapped in mourning veils. When Ducky offered Eleanor his arm at the chapel steps, murmurs swept through the crowd. The union once whispered about in scandal was now paraded before them, transformed by tragedy. Yet it was not pity that filled the eyes of those who watched, but something like awe. For the first time, Ducky realized that Eleanor's quiet strength had accomplished what his rage never could. It had conquered judgment itself. That evening, at a political assembly held in one of the grand halls of Westminster, Ducky stood before the very men who had once celebrated his ruin. They had expected his continued resentment. They did not expect his civility. He spoke not as a victim, but as a man who had learned the futility of hatred. "Let those who speak of scandal," he said, his voice carrying through the murmuring crowd, "remember that reputation is but smoke, and virtue is the fire beneath. I have wronged a woman whose dignity outlived the mockery of us all, and I count myself blessed that she bears my name." Eleanor, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt tears rise unbidden. For once, Ducky's words were not armor but truth. The applause began hesitantly, then grew until it filled the hall. The men who had scorned them bowed, the women curtsied. Reputation, that fragile god of their world, had turned in their favor. Later, beneath the gaslights of the garden, the night was still. The hum of the city softened into distance. Eleanor stood by the fountain, its water glinting silver under the moon. Ducky joined her, his expression stripped of pride. "I do not deserve your forgiveness," he said quietly. She looked at him, her voice gentle but firm. "Forgiveness is not deserved, Charles. It is given, and it is not a single act, but a life's work." He smiled faintly at the sound of his given name, spoken without bitterness. "Then allow me to spend that life earning it." She stepped closer, the faint scent of lavender rising from her gown. "You already have, though you may not yet believe it." For a moment, they stood in silence, the distance between them closing with the simplicity of breath. He reached for her hand, and she led him. Around them, the garden seemed to exhale, the world no longer hostile but hushed, as though listening. "I thought love was conquest," he said at last, "something to win or lose. But you have taught me it is something one becomes." Her eyes softened. "Then become it, my lord, and do not look back." He bent, pressing his forehead to hers, and the gesture carried more devotion than any oath ever could. The world did not need to see their reconciliation. It was enough that they did. As dawn broke over the city, the bells of St. Paul's began to toll. Their carriage waited at the gates, ready to carry them back to the quiet north where everything had begun. Ducky paused at the threshold, glancing once more at the skyline he had long despised. The fog lifted in faint ribbons, revealing a sky washed clean. "Will you miss London?" he asked. "No," she said softly, "but I shall remember it, for here our ruin ended and our beginning began." He offered his hand, and she took it without hesitation. Together they stepped into the carriage, the wheels creaking in motion as the sun rose over the city. The narrator's voice might have whispered then, had the world been listening. In an age that prized propriety over truth, two souls found courage enough to love beyond the reach of judgment. Their story was not one of perfection, but of redemption, and redemption, once found, is never forgotten. As the carriage disappeared into the morning haze, a final image lingered. Eleanor's hand resting lightly atop his, her gaze turned toward the horizon. There was no triumph in their leaving, only peace, the kind earned through suffering and grace. And though London would soon forget the scandal that had once consumed them, it would not forget the way they had walked away together, as if the very world had bowed to their forgiveness.